You're listening to Unpaused, a podcast for women who want to stage a career comeback or mastermind a new one after an extended break from work. I'm your host, Judy Stewart, and if you want to reclaim your career but don't know how, then this is the podcast for you.
Judy, tell me what prompted you to create Unpaused.
I was asked when I was the CEO of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation to go and speak on International Women's Day to the women of Goldman Sachs in Sydney. I was working on a very big project which Goldman's were partnering with us on, and they felt it would be good for me to go and talk about the work that the foundation was doing with the firm. But they asked me also to tell them something of my own personal journey, which in the end caused me to really dig deep about lots of things that had happened along the way. And one of the things that had happened along the way was that I'd had a 15-year gap when I'd stopped quite a stillborn legal career to have these 4 children. And then I'd come back and little by little built up a network in the not-for-profit sector, which had ultimately led to me being the CEO of the foundation. The women at Goldman Sachs told me when they were asking questions, they didn't talk to me at all about the work I was doing at the foundation. They were interested in how I was possibly brave enough to leave for 15 years and how on earth did I end up in this what to them looked like a very glamorous and exciting role. How on earth did I pull that off? Because they weren't even game to stop for any purpose, to do extra study, to have a family, to look after a sick relative. They were not game to get off the treadmill. And it was a question that, having been asked, suddenly I was being asked it all the time. Because I wasn't a marine biologist, people would expect me to be a marine biologist when I go into a meeting, and they'd say, "Oh, Professor Stewart, welcome." And I'd say, "Well, actually, I'm not a professor." And then they'd say, "Well, who are you?" And so I'd start this story about I was a lawyer who came to the job at the foundation via chamber music. And it set up this whole conversation. And so people would say, how do you do that? How do you do that flip from law to music to science? So when I stopped doing that role, I thought, I'm going to write this down, because it so disturbed me that these young women were just not game to take more control of their life and to make sure that they were doing all the things that a human should experience in a lifetime. You can't just be a working person. There's a lot more to life.
With the benefit of hindsight, is there one thing that you would do differently about that 15 years?
Well, there are quite a few things I'd do differently, but I think that the easiest thing to say that I really regret is that I didn't take an hour a day to work on my career when I was at home with 4 screaming children. I always felt I was so busy and so pushed and so occupied, but actually I could have set aside a small amount of time every day to work on something that was important to me. I should have gone back and done an MBA long before I ever started one. I could have done all of that, and I just didn't have the perspective of the long-term view. If you look at an hour a day cumulatively, you can do an enormous amount in a year.
But the other thing that I think can disappear very easily when you leave the workforce and you take that pause is confidence. You lose your belief in your own ability. You become a mother, sometimes that can be a terrible shock. You may not be very good at it, and your confidence gets sucked out of you. What is your understanding of how to retain your professional confidence when you take a pause?
Well, I'd have to say that I've been through all of the above. And in fact, my husband and I were admitted to the bar on the same day. And as it turned out, I was pregnant and my career went backwards and he went forwards. And so I would find myself as a young woman, a young mother, going to these bar dinners, and I'd be treated like a complete moron. And I'd sit there thinking, I've got exactly the same qualification as everybody at this table. And I'm treated like a complete idiot. So my confidence plummeted, but you feel so powerless. I mean, I had a great husband and he was very encouraging, but you feel so powerless and voiceless. And I think the point of this exercise I've been through is to do a lot more analysis of what assets you actually have in play and what you can do with them. Because I think when you're in that unconfident state, there's a lot of negative self-talk, whereas I think if you went down the coaching road, a coach would say to you, look, you've got an enormous number of moving parts here that we can galvanise and maybe put together in a different configuration that can propel you forward. So they're the sorts of things that I explore.
How do you get a new dose of confidence?
I think confidence comes in very small increments. No one wakes up confident one day. You've got to have some small achievements, some small goals. It's like fitness.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it a muscle that you flex and you flex?
Yeah, it's like fitness. You know, you can commit to getting fit in 2019, but actually you have to get out of bed every day, put those clothes on and do the work. And I don't think that you can actually shy away from this. You know, reinvention and unpausing is not something that happens magically. You have to do the work. That's not to take away from the fact that I think a big chunk of this problem is confidence. And actually, I just read an article where Christine Lagarde has made a speech talking about just this issue. It's a confidence issue a lot of the time. But you build that confidence with increments. I realised when I was at home that having had children quite young, that by the time I was 40, the children will all either be finished school or the younger ones will be almost on their way. And I knew that I would have to make between 40 and 50 work really hard if I was going to have any sort of interesting life once the children grew up. I was going to have to make it happen myself. I sat next to John Harvey at an Australian Chamber Orchestra fundraiser, and I sort of said to me that they weren't doing nearly enough in Brisbane and that they were looking for somebody to do a bit of this and that and fundraising. And in the course of the conversation that evening, I'd made it clear I was starting to look around for something. And he said, you know, would you be interested in being that person? It was on a voluntary basis. And I said I thought I would. And the interesting thing there was that the CEO of the orchestra at the time was a fellow called Tim Walker, and I had quite a bit to do with him in the course of this fundraising role, and he was the fundraiser extraordinaire. And I learnt a lot from him. That was where I got my first big break, and really fundraising became the sort of the critical and transferable skill that really was the thread of my post-children career.
You mentioned family before, in your case, the 4 boys. One of the new expressions that we're all hearing these days, of course, is the sandwich generation. So you may be looking after children who may not leave home until either 27 or 32, apparently, is the new average. And then you've also got parents who may be living to 100. And so you're squeezed between 2 lots of people that you may have responsibilities for. Is it important in the unpaused story to look for workplaces that are carer friendly?
Yes, I think it's absolutely essential. And this is where bigger corporations can be much more attractive because they have the resources to enable you to shift and pause and restart. It's much harder in a smaller company. Having said that, I also observe that women who want more flexibility are creating careers for themselves on their own terms. There just comes a point where a lot of women will say, I don't want to do this anymore. And I've spoken to one woman in particular, a very senior position with a very big global firm. And she said to me, women don't really leave their careers necessarily for the family, because things are a lot more accommodated now with families. But women will leave their careers because of their disaffection with the culture or the expectations. They just say, actually, I've looked at what the other side of the hill looks like and I don't want to go there. I want to do something that suits my life. And I think that's a good thing. I think a lot of women are taking more entrepreneurial approaches to how they manage a career.
Can you stay connected professionally, literally, by being online via Skype and various other apps? Is that important to master technology and not to fear it?
Well, I think there are two aspects of that. Two big takeaways are you absolutely have to stay up to date with technology because it's driving so much change and it's creating so much accessibility and permeability, really. So that's absolutely critical. And that's so fixable. You know, those sorts of skills are very available and accessible. But the second thing is that keeping your networks alive or reviving dormant networks can be done to an extent virtually. You can stay in touch with people through these various professional social media platforms, and you can also stay up to date via, there's an enormous amount of information and education becoming available via websites, via podcasts. That seems to be a thing that I notice with women my age, professional women, who in some cases are no longer working. They must be spending a lot of time on their own or driving, but they are all the queens of, you know, what are the latest podcasts? And they digest an enormous amount of content in digital form. And I think staying on top of all of that and feeling like you're tapped into what's current and what's happening, which is sort of the counterpoint to feeling isolated and alone.
So do you have a favourite app or do you have a favourite platform that you use to illustrate exactly that?
Well, I am completely obsessed with podcasts. I've reached a lot of people through their podcasts. You know, I've been interested in, I've got into contact with and said I want to learn more. I've bought their books. I've mastered some new technologies by myself by exploring it through podcasts, you know, the podcast. Yeah, I know, I really have. And I've enjoyed it. And I feel like it's something I can control and I don't have to be sitting down to do it. So I can move around and get other things done. I spend a bit of time in the car moving between A and B, and it's an hour and 20-minute journey. And I make that hour and 20 minutes work all the time. I can't bear to fritter that time away.
No, that is very precious time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually very good time, that travelling time, I think, for creative thinking, but as you say, also for absorbing new information from wherever.
And not being interrupted, you know, so you can control that flow of information and really concentrate. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, in your own pause, in that 15 years where you did also produce 4 sons, you went into the not-for-profit sector, and the not-for-profit sector seems to be a very useful kind of laboratory for growing your career back after a gap.
I think one of the big unknowns about the not-for-profit sector that I really understand now is that it is expected that every senior business person will contribute to the not-for-profit sector in some meaningful way. So what I learned was, if I had become the most important lawyer in Australia, if that legal career had extended in its usual way, I would never have met the people that I met through the not-for-profit sector. I was working with the most senior people in Australia at the foundation and learning from them every day. I tried to really soak up from them as much as I possibly could. I don't know how aware they were of the fact that I think they call it trolling now. I was trolling them professionally. I was trying to learn as much as I could while I worked with them. And I mean, it was amazing to be running, as a CEO, to be reporting to the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank in his boardroom and watching him run a meeting and managing my dynamic with him. I mean, most people will never see the chair of the Commonwealth Bank chairing a meeting. My big advice to someone who's really struggling with a pause is to look into a pathway or bridging one career and another through and involvement with the not-for-profit sector. I mean, A, there are huge issues that are being addressed by these not-for-profits that are completely fascinating and needing good people. B, there are really great people who are getting involved in a lot of these issues on a voluntary basis. And C, you can just learn a lot and feel more valued, I think, by getting involved in that world to the point where I don't think you need to be doing everything for nothing forever. I think that's a really important point, especially to make to women. I think there's a point at which you have to say, okay, well, look, I'm prepared to do this on a voluntary basis to this point, but beyond that, I want to be paid. And I think that that's a bit of a warning. But from the perspective of the people I met and what I learnt from them in those roles, it was absolutely an invaluable experience. Interestingly, there was a report in the Financial Times to say that the UK government had created a fund to encourage firms to go and retrieve former employees who are keen to work and to incentivise them to do that. So it's a bit of a push me, pull you. I think enlightened firms understand that that investment is a wasted investment unless they proactively go back and retrieve it. But equally at a policy level, governments are realising the effect that this could have, that the re-entry of these valuable workers could have on GDP. And that work on the value that is being foregone has been done. And the other thing that's really driving it, and this is the sort of the policy spine of the book, is the commitment that both governments and business are now making to gender equality targets. If we do nothing more than what we're doing today, and there's quite a lot being done today, we won't see gender equality in the workplace for another 170 years. It's hard to believe. So if you want to achieve these targets more quickly, you're going to have to address this drain of female talent that seems to happen mid-career, just as women are basically hitting their straps. And this is actually a pretty easy way of doing it. There's a lot happening at the policy level and the institutional level, and it's starting to happen more at the corporate level. But if you're a woman sitting at home thinking, I wish someone would find me, I feel as though I've got a lot to give, and I know that I've done a lot of work myself. You know, I've got a good degree, I've done some hard yards in the workplace. If you could bridge that gap between where she is and where the big institutions are, the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and the UN, and what governments and businesses are doing in the middle, you'd get a really good outcome. I think it's very easy when you're in full flight in a career to let those friendship networks fall away, because friendship networks take a lot of work to nurture and maintain. And the double whammy that a woman who's had a big career can experience is that she goes home, she's lost her identity that she associated with her working life, but she can also be very lonely. So reviving those networks is very important. And yes, they could be very helpful to you. And I think, again, the science will tell you that often the opportunities come from the least likely sources. It's not the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank that will help you find that next role. It'll be someone who's on the periphery often of your life that you bump into in a very accidental way. I think the important thing is for a woman in that position to tell someone she's looking. The worst thing she can do is to harbour that secret for reasons of pride or feeling that she's not confident enough to tell someone. The lucky breaks that I have had have come my way because I've been sitting next to someone or talking to someone and I've told them I'm looking, or I'd be open to something, and I've had a go. And that's again where the not-for-profit sector can come in, that it gives you the opportunity in a reasonably low commitment way at the start to have a go and try a few different things and to see how it actually feels.
Annabelle Crabb says that every successful woman needs a wife. Now, do you agree with that?
Oh, I totally agree. And, you know, it's just so hard to be all things to all people. I totally agree with Annabelle Crabb on that. And you sort of want that old school 1950s wife. You know, you want someone to look after you because it's really hard to be giving all day and then have to come home and give again after hours, unless someone is sort of replenishing those supplies. And in fact, a very good example of that is, I don't know if you've ever read Madeleine Albright's autobiography, but it's such a good book. She's very comfortable, I suppose because she's just so incredibly secure and senior, in talking about how difficult she found it when she first became the American ambassador to the UN. And she had a grace and favour apartment in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which was very posh. But she had, as a result of her divorce, farm down in Virginia. She said the worst thing was that it didn't matter whether she was in New York or in Virginia, whatever she needed to wear that day was always in the other house. Anyway, she decided she just couldn't cope on her own. Even though she had tons of help and all sorts of people around her, she decided that what she needed was effectively a wife. So her sister had recently been divorced, and so she invited her to apply for the position, and her sister became effectively her wife because she just felt she couldn't run the life that she needed to run with the expectations that attached to her being a woman. So, for instance, she had to entertain a lot at her apartment. And she said she had a cook and a butler and a this and a that, but she needed a wife to sort of inject the female touches that were expected, which, quite frankly, Madeleine Albright did not have time to do. So Annabelle Crabb's right, but that's something that really stayed with me about Madeleine Albright. I set out to write a book, but I quickly became involved with a publisher who told me that I would have to cultivate my own audience in order to convince a publisher to publish the book. And she encouraged me to create a podcast. And the podcast, Unpaused the Podcast, now has a life of its own. Having thought about the podcast, I realised that actually the whole issue of Unpaused is really part of what you could loosely term a movement, and that there is a serious policy agenda that underpins it. And that was how I got very interested in gender equality. So the third component of the Unpaused project is now a white paper that I'm writing, which is really about the policy spine that supports the broader discussion about why this is important. And I do think that this is the right time to be having this discussion. Everyone's looking at women differently all of a sudden, but I think I look at that from the top down level. There's a lot happening, but I also sense that during the course of doing these podcast interviews with different people who've had big pauses and come back from them, I get the sense that there's a real appetite to talk about these things, for the people who've experienced them to actually speak up and say, this is what I went through and this is how I came out of it. So it's the macro and micro levels. It's a good time. I've got different categories of people that I want to talk to. Obviously, people who've had the personal experience of some cataclysmic career event and staged their own recovery from that. I've got people who are experts on the policy side, so talking about the issues that are percolating at a policy level in terms of gender equality and promoting women, etc. There are historical figures that this was one of the things I was very interested in. I've got various people from history that I've always been interested in and who really inspired me at times when I was finding the going tough at work. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt is my absolute heroine, as is Franklin Roosevelt. Oh, well, he's obviously not my heroine, but my hero. I mean, they came back, each of them, from personal tragedy. Churchill, and even Clementine Churchill, his wife. Madeleine Albright, obviously, is someone I'm very interested in. So there's sort of a rich vein of historical figures I'd like to explore in the podcast. And then there are people who are actually sort of technical experts on aspects of Unpaused, people who've got something to say about a more scientific approach to various aspects like networking. I mean, there's a lot of business literature out there that I would like to incorporate into the book and into the podcast so that, I can't be the expert on absolutely everything. And there are people who have written books that will feed into this whole narrative. So it's quite a big endeavour, but I can see, yes, it's got a very long tail and it'll have a life of its own. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unpaused. I'd love you to subscribe on iTunes or share the podcast with someone you think might like it. You can find the show notes or sign up for news on my website, unpaused.net, or see what we're up to on Instagram or my LinkedIn page. Bye for now.